Good morning, sir, Mr. Deputy President. Next to the Deputy President, as you can see, obviously different, is the President and Chairman of Council, Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Gabriel Idahosa, FCA. Next to the President is the DG of the Chamber, Dr. Chinyere P. Sadmuna, FCA. Last but not the least is also a Vice President here at the Chamber and Chair of the Public Advocacy Committee, Sir Ladi Smith, FCA. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to hand you over to the President as he addresses us this morning on the state of the nation. And once again, thank you so much. Mr. President, sir.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen of the press, on behalf of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, I extend our warm compliments to you as we gather for this third press conference in 2025. I thank you again for joining us on this collective journey of water where we review the significant economic developments of the previous quarter and articulate our perspectives and the government. As the foremost advocacy body for the private sector in Nigeria, we remain committed to promoting a thriving, inclusive, and sustainable business environment. Today, we provide an informed assessment of the state of Nigeria's economy and outline critical issues that have shaped the economic landscape in the last quarter. This approach has become a hallmark of our policy advocacy efforts, driven by our unwavering commitment to fostering a stronger economy and a more business-enabling environment. Through comprehensive macroeconomic diagnostics during these briefing sessions, we aim to spotlight critical areas of concern while presenting actionable recommendations to governments. We aim to champion policy alternatives that empower the private sector to thrive and contribute meaningfully to national development. I want to take this opportunity to extend a special acknowledgement and heartfelt appreciation to the media. Your steadfast contributions have been instrumental in amplifying our advocacy efforts over the years. As an institution dedicated to protecting and promoting business interests, we deeply value this enduring partnership and your commitment to fostering an informed and engaged society. Together, we can continue to shape an economic landscape that benefits businesses and strengthens our national economy. We will start with the global economic environment. In the second quarter 2025, the global economy was weakened by US tariffs, trade tensions, geopolitical unrest, and uncertainty. With escalating tariff wars between the United States and the European Union, and the US and BRICS member countries and partners, global trade is expected to reach an all-time low, resulting in disruption of supply chains, economic slowdown risks, and fragile growth in the EU on the back of expected retaliatory tariffs and investment climate uncertainties. In the light of global trade and geopolitical dynamics, we call on the federal government to reconsider its foreign policy mix to ensure that Nigeria is not left behind in global affairs and as it affects particularly international trade. In our recent alignment with BRICS, we must wisely choose our trade partners and global alignments to avoid consequences that can negatively affect our worldwide reputation and pursuits. In the face of continued tariff crisis and uncertainty, we must pay more attention to seriously supporting non-oil exports to more favorable destinations as we recalibrate our trade partnerships. With about 3,000 products now permitted to enter the United Kingdom at very favorable terms in a new policy shift And just as the United States continues to announce more tariffs on Nigerian exports to the United States, it is time to support targeted exporters to increase our foreign earnings. The global economic outlook itself can be characterized by the following. A range of risks, starting with concern that further trade fragmentation, including new tariff hikes and retaliatory actions, could intensify the growth slowdown and trigger significant disruptions in cross-border supply chains. Global spending on defense is expected to rise to meet contemporary security concerns. NATO countries have committed to increasing defense spending with a new target of 5% of GDP. This may strain the budget for critical human development areas like education, international aid and development, and global healthcare support programs. The outlook for inflation remains vulnerable to external shocks, including spillovers from trade tensions and heightened financial and commodity price volatility. Central banks are under pressure to slow, pause, or reverse their monetary easing cycles. The near-term budget pressures from debt service costs and military spending will be compounded in the long run by persistent costs associated with climate mitigation, adaptation, and population aging. Sizable primary deficits, elevated interest payments, and lower growth will keep public debt ratios high and rising in many OECD economies over 2025 and 2026. Higher debt payments could increase fiscal pressure on governments worldwide, while tighter financial conditions will pose significant risks for low-income countries. Equity markets have recovered from a recent slump, but remain quite volatile. With the extra 10% tariff on Nigeria due to its alignment with the BRICS from the Trump administration, we believe that the country should adopt a multi-pronged policy response that safeguards its national interests, asserts its development priorities, while avoiding being caught in greater power rivalries around the world. We recommend that the government engage in bilateral dialogue with the United States to discuss concerns and reaffirm Nigeria's strategic importance as the West African leader and key partner. The negotiation should focus on sector-specific exemptions from tariff, emphasizing non-oil exports. Nigeria must pursue a non-aligned, interest-driven foreign policy by positioning BRICS membership as a vehicle for economic cooperation and not political alignment. Also, emphasis should be on Nigeria's sovereign rights to pursue partnerships that address its development needs, especially in areas like infrastructure, energy transition, and digital inclusion. The Chamber recommends that Nigeria strengthen regional and South-South trade by expanding trade within ECOWAS and the AFCFTA, reducing overdependence on Western markets. We should also negotiate preferential trade terms with BRICS, especially China, India, and Brazil, to offset losses from US tariffs. We urge the federal government to deliberately implement a strategic trade diversification plan, accelerate reforms to improve the business environment, attract non-aligned investors, and incentivize local industries most affected by US tariffs to find alternative markets. We recommend government strengthen domestic capacity and industrial policy by pursuing a national industrialization strategy, investing in manufacturing, agro-processing, and local value chains, and reduce the country's over-reliance on oil exports, which may face decreased demand in the US under the tariff regime. We should also leverage multilateral platforms like the World Trade Organization, UNCTAD, and the African Union to raise concerns over punitive economic measures targeting developing countries and their sovereignty. The domestic economy, first quarter of this year, the Lagos Chamber of Commerce acknowledges the recent release of Nigeria's rebased GDP figures and the quarter one 2020-25 growth data that we are seeing. With a real growth of 3.1% and nominal GDP now recorded at 372 trillion naira, this development offers a more comprehensive and contemporary reflection of the Nigerian economy, capturing vibrant informal activities, tech-driven enterprises, and service-oriented sectors that were previously under the radar. The rebasing from 2010 to 2019 brings Nigeria closer to global statistical standards and reveals a more diversified economy where real estate, trade, telecoms, and crop production now dominate, while the oil industry's share continues to decline. However, behind the optimistic figures lies our reality. Economic conditions have put a large portion of the population into poverty. Inflation pressures have continued to weaken our purchasing power, and rising cost of living has continued to reduce the quality of life of our people. Inflation remains unrelenting, especially in the food segment, an alarming indicator in a country where most household expenditure is food-related. The Naira's depreciation, now hovering above 1,530 Naira to the dollar, has severely diminished real incomes, while energy costs from petrol and diesel to cooking gas remain painfully high. These pressures affect both households and businesses, worsening inequality and making daily survival a struggle for a large majority of the population. Therefore, this is a call to action. The government must move from statistical celebration to strategic economic transformation, taking the following steps that we recommend. 1, stabilizing the Naira must be a top priority. This requires restoring FX confidence, boosting non-oil exports, and supporting domestic production. 2, food security must be urgently addressed through input subsidies, storage systems, and improved logistics to combat inflation and hunger. 3, the government must intensify efforts to empower SMEs and the informal sector through access to finance, aggressive operationalization of the 2025 Nigerian Tax Reform Act, and deployment of digital tools. 4, we need targeted job creation programs, especially in agriculture, construction, and technology, backed by aggressive skills development programs. 5, restore the citizens' confidence through transparency, social protection, and visible policy implementation. International development agencies like the World Bank and the IMF have projected Nigeria's GDP growth at 3.6% for last year and 4.1% this year, to be driven by an expected increase in oil production and the services like financial economy, telecoms, and the ICT. Improvement in local refining capacity is expected to ease energy costs, save foreign exchange spending, and attract more investments into the oil and gas sector. However, we urge government to pay continuous attention to inflation and the foreign exchange market and sustain efforts in fiscal and monetary policy interventions. On the Article 5 consultation by the IMF to Nigeria, the Executive Board of IMF highlighted that GDP growth of 3.4% in 2024 was driven mainly by increased hydrocarbon output and the vibrant services sector. Meanwhile, agriculture remains subdued owing to security challenges and sliding productivity. We expect growth from the new domestic refineries, higher oil production, and robust services to sustain and perhaps exceed the GDP growth projections. The IMF's advice is clear: recalibrate the budgets, tighten monetary policy, protect the poor, and push deeper structural and institutional reforms to ensure these macroeconomic gains translate into inclusive and resilient development. We therefore call on government to sustain the ongoing reforms. While we do not have any GDP figures yet for this year, we call for support for the identified growth-enhancing sectors like power, energy, particularly renewable energy, infrastructure, and service sectors in order to sustain and hopefully surpass the growth projections. The Nigeria First policy. The LCCI welcomes the introduction of the Nigeria First policy as a timely, strategic response to the US tariff hikes and global trade tensions. However, to achieve a meaningful impact with the policy, the government should ensure the following. First, significantly boost local production capacity. This requires addressing critical factors working against productivity, including high energy costs, inadequate energy supply, insufficient and inefficient transportation and logistics infrastructure. Two, the federal government should align the policy with the administration's food security agenda and encourage subnational governments to replicate similar policies at their level. Three, the government should demonstrate leadership by prioritizing the procurement of locally made goods, including vehicles and basic needs like refreshments across all ministries, departments, and agencies at all levels, that is state, federal, state, and the local government. The government should support SMEs through targeted concessionary financing, tax reliefs, and human capacity improvements to enable them to take full advantage of the policy's opportunities. The LCCI urges the Nigerian Orientation Agency to develop and execute a robust public awareness campaign to communicate the goals and benefits of the Nigeria First policy to all Nigerians. Monetary policy developments. In the first half of 2025, the Monetary Policy Committee met for the second time in May to retain the monetary policy rate MPRO at 27.5%, with all other parameters on hold. This pause follows 14 consecutive rate hikes enacted since April 2022, amounting to 1,600 basis points of tightening. The pause implies that businesses and households can now begin to expect an easing of rates if the central bank further curbs inflation in the near term. The private sector, which serves as the engine of growth and employment in Nigeria, has been plagued with increased borrowing costs, reduced investment incentives, and heightened uncertainties in our policy environment. However, with a positive inflation outlook and stability in the foreign exchange market, we expect the rate to remain unchanged and gradually ease in this year's second half. As a result, businesses may find it easier to finance expansion plans, potentially boosting job creation and economic output. At the Chamber, we have consistently advised that rate hikes alone will not curb inflation without resolving the challenges of the real sector, which comprises the agriculture and manufacturing. While we appreciate that the current reforms may have started to have some impact on stabilizing the exchange rates, easing headline inflation, and increasing government revenue, we must restate that interest rate at 27.5% remains a depressing burden on businesses. We therefore desire to see a reduction in the monetary policy rate. Having examined key economic indicators, including inflation dynamics, exchange rate movements, fiscal developments, and global monetary trends, we may expect to see a possible hold on the monetary policy rate by the committee. Inflation. Nigeria's inflation eased to 22.2% in June, making the fourth consecutive monthly decline since March. This downward trend reflects the impact of tighter monetary policy, relative stability in the foreign exchange market, and easing food prices in some regions. Food inflation, however, rose to 21.9, that's 22% in June, and 21.14 in May, implying an increase of 0.83% points. Similarly, the core inflation increased by about 0.5% to 22.7 in June. Despite this progress, inflation remains elevated, mainly driven by persistent food inflation, high energy costs, and structural inefficiencies in supply chains. The Central Bank of Nigeria is expected to maintain a cautious stance, balancing the need to contain inflation to support economic recovery. If sustained, the continued moderation in inflation could create room for interest rates to ease in the second half of the year, improving access to credit for businesses and consumers. To support this expectation, we must proactively deal with climate change, increasing threats and impacts as seen in the flooding of many parts of the country. Food inflation has continued to defy all applicable measures so far due to the persistent threats from insecurity around our farmlands. So the primary policy action is improving security rather than looking at interest rates. The foreign exchange market. In the second quarter of 2025, the Naira continued to maintain its stability. It appreciated by about 0.5% in value against the dollar in the official market from 1,536.32 kobo at the end of March to 1,529 at the end of June. Compared to the parallel market, the premium remained within the maximum benchmark of 5% in the period. The chamber recognizes the stability of the exchange rate for some time was due to the strict central bank's foreign exchange market transparency and orthodox monetary policy stance, resulting in investors' confidence and a rise in foreign capital inflows. Also, a unified exchange rate has curbed speculative demand that previously inflated the market. At the same time, a significant decline in the importation of refined petroleum products due to domestic refining has resulted in a decrease in demand for foreign exchange. Despite the gains recorded by the Naira, the country's external reserves maintained a downward trajectory. The data from the central bank reveals that Nigeria's external reserves declined by 1.1 billion in the second quarter of 2025, from 38.3 billion at the end of March to 37.2 billion at the end of June, reflecting a decrease of 3%. The decline reflects a significant drop in foreign exchange inflows from crude oil due to decreased oil prices and a dip in oil production. We can achieve the 2 million barrels per day target if we focus on the most critical issues around oil thefts, pipeline vandalism, and boosting local refining capacity to further improve our foreign exchange position. On the fiscal policy environment, Nigeria's macroeconomic policy environment remains at a crossroads, with reform momentum frequently hindered by implementation delays and stakeholder resistance. Nevertheless, progress has been recorded in key areas such as fiscal consolidation, digital governance, and steps towards regulatory harmonization. A significant milestone is the enactment of the Nigerian Tax Act 2025, passed in June, which promises to simplify our hitherto complex tax system. The Act consolidates 7 federal taxes into a single unified platform, eliminates redundant levies at state and local levels, and mandates digitization of tax reporting via a centralized system managed by the Federal Inland Revenue Service. These measures are expected to lower compliance costs, especially for SMEs and digital service providers. However, for these reforms to succeed, Compliance enforcement must follow clear regulations, broader stakeholder engagement, and sustain taxpayer education to rebuild trust in the system. We commend FRS's recent decision to suspend enforcement of non-resident company taxes on SMEs operating on digital platforms, a pragmatic step that acknowledges the unique challenges faced by small businesses in the digital economy, and one that should be codified through more explicit tax code definitions. The 2025 federal government budget. In Nigeria's upper chamber stretched the life of the 2024 Appropriation Acts capital vote from 30 June 2025 to 31 December 2025 to keep road, power, healthcare, and defense projects from stalling. The legislation covers an original 9.9 trillion capital envelope inside a 34 trillion budget. Supplementary additions have since lifted the capital tally to roughly 13 trillion. We support the goal of finishing projects, but caution that serial rollovers of budgets can significantly corrode budget credibility. With crude oil prices largely below USD 70 in recent months, and even in July, we advise reviewing the 2025 federal budget oil benchmark, which still stands at $75, as the low price may persist further, looking at current geopolitics and tariff wars. This will indicate that we must rework our fiscal variables to manage expenditure, since revenue targets may not and are very likely not be achieved. Nigeria's debt position. As of March 2025, Nigeria's total debt stood at 150 trillion, reflecting a year-on-year increase of 27 trillion or 23% compared to 122 trillion in the same period last year. This also represents a quarter-on-quarter rise of 5 trillion or 3.3%. The continued increase in debt stock is primarily attributed to new borrowings by the federal government and the depreciation of the naira, which inflated the currency value of the local currency value of Nigeria's external loans. Significantly, although the actual rise in external debt in dollars was modest, the weakening naira exchange used in the first quarter of this year amplified the debt. The Debt Management Office noted this currency exposure as a key driver of rising debt services. On the domestic side, the federal government remains the dominant borrower, accounting for 75 trillion of the domestic stock. In comparison, subnational governments and the FCT held 4 trillion, a slight decline from the previous quarter. Instruments such as bonds, treasury bills, sukuk, and green bonds continue to underpin domestic borrowing, which, while insulated from currency volatility, raises concerns about rising interest rates and the crowding out of private sector credit. Overall, the structure of Nigeria's debt ratio as of the first quarter of this year comprised 53% domestic and 47% external debt, showing a marginal shift from the previous year. The LCCI remains concerned about the sustainability of the rising debts and urges the federal government to pursue revenue diversification, improve spending efficiency, and better debt management strategies to reduce fiscal pressure and restore macroeconomic stability. The Nigerian tax reform. On June 26, 2025, the President signed into law a landmark package of tax reforms comprising the Nigeria Tax Act, the Nigeria Tax Administration Act, the Nigeria Revenue Service Act, and the Joint Revenue Board Act, collectively referred to as the Nigerian Tax Reform Acts. These acts represent a comprehensive overhaul of Nigeria's tax framework and aim to enhance revenue generation, simplify compliance, promote investment, and align the Nigeria's tax regime with global standards. The key provisions include raising the exemption threshold for small businesses to 100 million in turnover and 250 million in assets, thereby exempting many SMEs from company income tax, capital gains tax, and the newly introduced development levy. These acts consolidate multiple sectoral levies into a 4% development levy for mid-sized to large-sized firms and introduces a 5% annual tax credit over 5 years for qualifying capital investments through the new economic development incentive. Technology reforms such as unified e-tax portals and mandatory invoicing will reduce administrative bottlenecks and promote transparency. The VAT reform allows full input VAT recovery and expands zero-rated essential goods, while a progressive personal income tax regime now exempts annual earnings below 800,000 and strengthens equity. Furthermore, establishing a tax ombudsman office and a codified taxpayer bill of rights ensures improved trust and independent resolution of tax-related complaints. The acts also redefine global taxation rules for multilateral, multinational, and non-resident entities and adjust the VAT sharing formula to increase the allocation to states 55% and local governments 35%, encouraging grassroots development. Overall, the Chamber commends the reform as a strategic step towards building a more transparent, inclusive, and investment-friendly tax environment, and calls on all business stakeholders to align proactively ahead of the expected implementation in January 2026. Sectorial developments. ICT and the creative economy. Nigeria's digital economy continues to exhibit remarkable resilience and innovation, despite persistent infrastructure deficits, regulatory bottlenecks, and security-related disruptions, as the infrastructure vulnerabilities remain a key threat. The Association of Licensed Telecom Operators of Nigeria reported over 80 instances of fiber optic cuts nationwide between April and June, leading to estimated service disruptions and losses exceeding 1.2 billion naira. These costs were primarily due to road construction activities, vandalism, and theft of network infrastructure, severely affecting mobile data services in underserved regions. Regulatory uncertainty dampens investor sentiment, especially around the data protection bill, fintech licensing, and data center infrastructure classification. There has been a delay in granting digital banking licenses to several credible fintech operators, leading to capital flights and slowed innovation. The federal government's May 2025 suspension of the cybersecurity levy, previously pegged at 0.5% of all electronic transactions, was a welcome intervention following intense pushback from industry stakeholders and consumer protection groups. A holistic review of the regulatory cost burden on digital enterprises must now follow this suspension. We acknowledge the government's renewed commitment to fast-tracking the National Artificial Intelligence Strategy announced in April and urge expedited stakeholder engagement on the blockchain adoption roadmap expected by the Q4 of this year. These frameworks are critical to positioning Nigeria as a regional leader in emerging technologies and digital sovereignty. Oil and gas. This sector, traditionally Nigeria's revenue backbone, continues to underperform due to structural inefficiencies, insecurity, and delayed policy execution. Though crude production has increased in recent months, Nigeria remains unable to meet its OPEC plus crude oil production quota of 1.8 million barrels per day. As of June 2025, actual crude production stood at 1.42 million barrels per day, constrained by pipeline vandalization, illegal bunkering in some states. Operational challenges at the Forcados and Bonny terminals and delays in concluding divestment agreements between international oil companies and indigenous operators. The average Brent crude price has rebounded from 72 in June, up from $66 in April, spurred by coordinated supply tightening by OPEC plus. On the domestic front, product pricing has not been stable or predictable enough to support investor confidence. Suppose the reduction we have recorded in recent months is sustained, we hope that we see a downward pressure on logistics and transport costs with positive implications for food inflation and industrial productivity. In the gas on governments to ensure transparent allocation of licenses, completion of major gas transport pipelines, and clarity on offtake frameworks to de-risk private investment in the sector. We strongly advocate for fully enforcing the Naira for crude swap framework to ensure consistent domestic crude supply for local refiners. On the Nigerian petroleum sector developments, the Chamber notes the declining global oil prices, inefficiency and underperformance of government-owned refineries. To address this, the Chamber recommends that the government consider selling or leasing all government-owned refineries to capable investors and create a favorable and competitive environment for private investments. The goal is to attract more investment in the oil refining space and to reduce the importation of refined petroleum products further. On the power sector, it remains intensely fragile and unable to meet industrial or household demand. The recent frequent line tripping and system outages highlight persistent instability in transmission infrastructure and generation shortfalls. The national peak generation in April 2025 was capped at 5.8 megawatts. This inadequate generation is compounded by gas supply shortages and illiquidity in the electricity value chain, which continues to hinder performance. The upward review of the electricity tariff adjustment under the MITO implemented in June triggered significant consumer dissatisfaction, notably as service quality has not improved proportionately. According to the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, only 5 out of 11 distribution companies met their minimum supply thresholds, further justifying calls for more vigorous enforcement of performance-based franchising. We reiterate the need to take the following actions. Accelerate phase 2 of the National Mass Metering Program. Empower sub-national governments to develop independent and hybrid mini-grids. Scale decentralized energy solutions. Provide FX access and tax reliefs for solar mini-grids and battery storage investors. With more organizations exiting the national grid to generate their own power through captive power arrangements, the government should create an enabling environment where these captive power arrangements can thrive. 5, renewable energy is the most sustainable power supply in the long run and the government should support this with required regulation and investment. We need subnational blueprints for attracting investments into the power sector in their states. Agriculture and food security. Nigeria's agriculture sector, which sustains the livelihood of over 70% of rural dwellers, is facing severe pressure in the 2025 farming season. Escalating header farmer conflicts in Benue, Nasarawa, and Plateau states are disrupting cultivation, while above normal rainfall linked to the ongoing cycle has caused flooding in Kogi, Niger, and Anambra states, damaging farmlands and displacing farming communities. Compounding these challenges are persistent distortions in fertilizer pricing and distribution. Market surveys show that stable food prices have surged by an average of 45% year on year. While domestic urea production has increased due to output from the Dangote refinery fertilizer plant, access remains constrained by high transportation costs, cross-border smuggling, and weak last-mile logistics in conflict-affected regions. In response, we call for urgent interventions, including expedited disbursements to special agro-industrial zones, subsidized rail transport of grains from production hubs to urban areas, and a means to improve security around farmers, farmlands, and agricultural supply chains. Ports and maritime sector. The Nigerian maritime sector is in urgent need of structural reform. The average cargo dwell time at Apapa port is 26 days, far above the 5.5 to 7 day average in regional peers like Ghana and South Africa. These inefficiencies stem from a combination of persistent manual processes at customs, bottlenecks in cargo examination, and a heavy human interface that can cause numerous stumbling blocks to cargo clearance. Adding to the pressure, the recent 15% tariff increase by the Nigerian Ports Authority, while intended to improve infrastructure, has drawn significant resistance from freight operators already burdened by inflation and exchange rate volatility. We therefore call for urgent implementation of the National Single Window Project, full automation of cargo clearance, and redeployment of mobile and digital cargo scanners at our ports. These measures are critical to reducing clearance delays, curbing corruption, and aligning Nigeria's port performance with international standards. That said, recent weeks have brought a few encouraging developments. Transport rates from the ports have dropped notably by as much as 60%. Just months ago, moving goods from the ports to areas like Ikeja could cost up to 1 million. Today, these logistic costs have come down significantly, making road transport more affordable for shippers and businesses. Moreover, the Nigeria Railway Corporation promotes rail as a viable alternative to road transport. Increased cargo movement by rail from Apapa to destinations within Lagos and as far as Ibadan is a welcome shift and one that we are closely monitoring and effectively encouraging. Nonetheless, challenges remain. Players continue to face many customs queries on imported goods, which cause delays and in some cases enable abuse. This persistent issue underscores the need for deeper collaboration with customs authorities, and the Chamber remains committed to ongoing engagement as part of our mandate and responsibility to the sector. Real estate and construction. The real estate and construction sector is facing a slowdown driven by economic pressures. Additionally, access to project financing remains limited as the MPR remains quite high at 27%. Compounding the issue is a widening supply-demand mismatch in the high-end property markets. To address these challenges and stimulate economic sectorial growth, we propose the creation of a centralized digital platform for land title and property registration, the complete digitization of certificates of occupancy processes across all states, and ensuring that federally backed mortgage finance and guarantee schemes deliver on rent-to-own models for middle-income individuals. The SME segment, representing over 96% of Nigerian businesses, continues to grapple with deep-rooted structural and macroeconomic challenges. Over 60% of them report persistent issues with electricity overbilling and the absence of prepaid meters. To address these challenges, the 150 billion CBN SME Intervention Fund, launched in April 2025, must be executed transparently, prioritizing support for export-ready and productive sector MSMEs. Beyond financing, we emphasize the need for targeted electricity subsidies for key productive clusters, such as industrial hubs. The Nigerian First policy, recently launched, needs to be enforced in favor of SMEs through inclusive procurement frameworks that link them with anchor buyers in agribusiness, manufacturing, and digital services. Distinguished gentlemen of the press, you have been a worthy partner in projecting our engagement with the government towards creating an enabling environment for advancing the Nigerian economy, of all investors, economic players. Lagos Chamber has consistently led its voice to solutions to our nation's challenges through engagements like this press conference. Let me reiterate our call from the government to tackle the many economic issues discussed, deliver democratic dividends for Nigerian citizens and businesses. As a private sector advocacy group with the mandates to promote the business community's interests, Lagos Chamber of Commerce shall continue to engage relevant government agencies, the media, other interest groups on actionable recommendations for a thriving business community. I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, we thank you for your time. At this point, we'd like to know if you have questions, clarifications you'd like to make, so the president can provide responses.
All right.
No?
All right. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. As usual, I know if you have your questions, you will have asked. Clearly, what it means is that the president has answered all our concerns. And I know in view of time, some of you, I see a brother from Tribune is giving me an eye to say, I need to go now. What I would just urge is what the president has also asked for, that as usual, you have always given our event the due publicity. You will also do the same for this. Once again, on behalf of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry and his leadership, I'd like to thank you for coming up this morning for this State of the Nation address. Once again, gentlemen of the press, thank you so much. We'd like to take some photo ops. The president and the leadership, please, would like to have this session of photo